Okay. Alrighty, I think we can get started. Welcome. My name is Livy, and I'm the programming assistant here at the La Crosse Public Library, and I'm very excited to be here with you all today for our program on creating inclusive bicycle communities with Marley Blonsky. Before we begin the program, I would first like to acknowledge that the city of La Crosse, including the library building where I'm streaming from tonight, the bike trails and streets that I utilize, and the bike shop where I service my bike, all occupy the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk, who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. If you are not in the city of La Crosse, I highly encourage you to research the Indigenous land that your home, community, place of work, and where you ride your bike all occupy. If you would like to help, or if you would like help with this research, we have staff at our library who can help you in the archives and local history department. We also have plenty of other resources available at any of our branches, and you can find out more info by visiting our website. I'm very excited to now introduce our wonderful presenter this evening, Marley Blonsky. Marley is a fat adventure cyclist who is creating, building, and supporting inclusive bicycle communities. She believes that all bodies belong on a bicycle, regardless of age, gender, size, race, or ability. Marley is working to change the bicycle industry from the inside out, working with bike brands to make stronger bikes for larger riders, bigger clothing, and to be more welcoming to all. And with that, I will hand it off to Marley.
Thank you so much, Livy, and thank you everyone for being here. This is really exciting. And I just want to confirm we've got 1 hour. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. I'm going to dive right in. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, make sure that you all can see it. How does that look?
Looks great.
Cool. So lots of content to go over, but I try and, if you ever see me present before, I'm pretty low key about this stuff. So feel free to, share resources with each other in the chat. I don't hold the key to all of this knowledge. And so, we're going to be talking about community. So feel free to share resources, ask questions in the chat, and we'll go from there. Thank you so much for doing the land acknowledgement. I am coming to you from Seattle. I'm about to move to Arkansas, but currently I am on unceded Duwamish land, which is a really interesting tribe if you're curious about the Pacific Northwest. All right, so let's dive in. So today I'm going to do a quick intro on myself. We're going to do a little bit about All Bodies on Bikes for those of you who may not be familiar with our group and the work that we do. We're going to talk a little bit about why this work matters. It's more than just bikes as a teaser. Talk about some barriers to inclusion, best practices, and as far as events, rides, and marketing. And I hope that, y'all will all ask questions during that time. Hopefully some of you are ride leaders or community leaders, and this will be really useful to you. And then we'll spend a little bit of time on allyship. But like I said, feel free to ask questions throughout. So about me, as Livy said, I'm a fat professional cyclist. It feels absolutely wild to say that. And I'll talk about the word fat and my intentional use of that in just a minute. But I recently got signed to Cannondale and Pearl Izumi and a couple other companies who are literally paying me to do this work and to make cycling more inclusive. Feel free to reach out at marley@allbodiesonbikes.com or on my Instagram at Marley Blonsky. There's a million ways to get in touch with me, and I'm happy to, have follow-ups or have more conversations. So All Bodies on Bikes is a group that I co-founded with Kaylee Kornhauser. If you saw the film that came out almost a year ago exactly, that's actually where the name came from. We were doing this work for probably 5 or 6 years before the film came out, and we didn't have a name for ourselves, but we were putting on workshops. But the name encompasses what we're all about. So our mission is to create a body size inclusive community, educate and change the industry, and like Livy said, ensure access to safe and comfortable equipment and clothing, and then finally just celebrate joyful movement on a bike. And we'll get into a little bit more about what joyful movement means, but one of the core ideas about All Bodies on Bikes is that I don't care how you ride a bike, whether you are commuting or just for recreation, or if you want to go out and do 100 miles or ride across the country, we want you to be able to do it safely and in a way that's joyful to you. So I'm like mode agnostic. You can mountain bike, you can gravel bike, you can ride a tricycle. Let's just make it enjoyable and accessible. So the way that we do that, our vision, I kind of already touched on this, but we really envision a world where anybody, regardless of body size, weight, perceived fitness level, and we're going to talk about that, can enjoy a bike ride in a way that's joyful to them. And we do that in 3 ways, primarily. Online communities. So we've got a really robust Facebook group, even though, we all have our opinions on Facebook, it's still useful for some things. But there's like 4,000 people on there, and it's honestly one of the most positive communities I've ever witnessed, where folks are sharing their rides or asking for advice or meeting up with each other. So we've got that. We do education and consulting. So talks like this, a lot of work with the bike industry itself, school groups, Boy Scout, Girl Scout troops, things like that. And then probably my most favorite part is group rides. So whenever I travel anywhere, try and set up a group ride to really demonstrate what an inclusive community looks like. All right, I'm just going to keep blowing through these, but if you do have a question, please put it into the chat or raise your hand, and I'll work with Livy to moderate those, but feel free to ask questions throughout. So, getting into why this work matters, it's not just a marketing shtick. Like, yes, a lot of people, actually 74% of people in the US are considered overweight by the CDC. I really don't like that word, so I try not to use it. But when we're talking about statistics, that's how the CDC classifies us. So if you're not including people in larger bodies as part of your community or as part of your marketing, you're missing out on a huge segment of the population that could and should be included. People in larger bodies also face a lot of discrimination at work. In 47 states, body size is not considered a protected class. So you can be fired for being fat in 47 states, which is pretty wild. Traveling, people have been asked to get off of airplanes. There's all sorts of horror stories out there. In healthcare settings, there are, I should have looked these facts up and had them ready to resource, but something like 75% of women have avoided scheduling a healthcare visit for fear that they wouldn't be taken seriously because of their weight. If you've ever had that experience, I know personally I have, I went in for a sore throat and they told me to lose weight. And it's like, okay, yeah, that'd probably be good for me, but can we talk about, whatever virus or bacteria is causing this issue instead of you admonishing me for my weight? So, this work matters for all sorts of reasons, the least of which is clothes and bicycles. Clothing and bicycles just happens to be something that a lot of us enjoy and use all the time. So it's a really great way to have this conversation that we don't normally talk about. So talking about language, I mentioned that I would briefly get into this. So you've heard me use the word fat a couple times already. I use it as a neutral descriptor of my body. Just like I'm 5'2", I'm blonde, I'm Jewish, I'm fat. Words only have the power that we give them. And so a lot of folks in the fat liberation space have started to reclaim that word. A word of caution, just because I call myself fat, I would not, just go around willy-nilly calling people in larger bodies fat. It's still, that word still carries a lot of weight, no pun intended. And a lot of us, have some trauma or bad associations with that word. So just be wary. And I always encourage folks to honor the language that people choose for themselves. So if somebody wants to call themselves overweight, that is their choice. Kind of a safe term that we direct people to use is people in larger bodies or people in smaller bodies, because there's nothing offensive about that. So yeah, if anybody has any other ideas or feelings on that, feel free to put it into the chat. These next two, obese and overweight, I try and avoid. Obese in the fat liberation community is often actually viewed as a slur. It comes from the Latin word obesus, which means to have eaten oneself fat, which if anybody has ever been in a larger body or known somebody who is larger, you know that there's a million reasons why our body sizes differ. And it might be because we like to eat, but that's not always the case. So it's it's pretty harmful to use the word obese. And it's also based like on the BMI, which has a very problematic history. I'm not going to get into that too much. But there is a phenomenal podcast called Maintenance Phase that has a really, really good episode about the BMI and why it's problematic. And they do a much better job explaining it than I ever could. Similar with overweight and underweight for that matter, both of those terms imply that there is an ideal weight for somebody to be at. And none of you are my doctor. I'm not anybody else's doctor. It's not my place to say you're overweight or underweight. The name of the podcast, Bethany, I'll put it into the chat, is Maintenance Phase. I forget, it came out maybe 3 or 4 months ago. And they don't have that many episodes, so it's not too far back, but they talk about the BMI quite a bit on one specific episode. And so then 2 other terms that I would love to dig into is joyful movement and community versus group. So joyful movement is a term that we have borrowed from the health at every size movement. And the whole idea here is moving your body in a way that feels good to you. There's a bit of a slippery slope when you start talking about people in larger bodies and exercise or biking, and getting into a narrative that you have to move your body to be like a good fat person. And I want to avoid that and just say, any way that you move your body that feels good to you, we're here for it. Whether dancing, biking, walking, running, gardening, whatever. Moving our bodies is a good thing. And then finally, community versus group. And that actually leads me to my next slide. And I would love to hear some thoughts on this of, what do you think are the differences between a group and a community? This is something that I hadn't really put a lot of thought into until we started being really intentional about creating communities, as opposed to just a group. So I don't know if anybody has thoughts on that they want to put into the chat or come off of mute. We'll take a couple minutes just to pause on this reflection point. And it's okay if you're feeling shy. Yeah, thank you, Vanessa. So if you're in the chat, if you all can open up the chat, Vanessa put some really great feedback that community is a group of people connected through shared vulnerability. Totally, that is a huge part of it. When I do this presentation in person, it's kind of fun to break up into groups and throw words up onto a piece of paper. But in our new virtual world, we're figuring this out. So I'm going to go ahead and keep going. Oh, here we go. Kathleen said community seems more inclusive and group sounds more cliquish. Yeah, that could definitely be the case as well. The way that we use the term is a community for us shares common goals and values, whereas a group, you might share a similar interest, or you might share a similar identifying property about yourself. A community, to me and to All Bodies on Bikes, is all about looking out for the well-being of each other, and truly wanting what is best for other members of the community. So the way that I think about this in a bicycling sense is I can be a member of a larger group of bicyclists who are using a trail. Our shared identifier might be that we are on this trail together, but that doesn't necessarily make us in a community. Sometimes it does. Livy and I were talking at the beginning of this podcast about, I recently attended an event race, both in Oklahoma, called the Mid-South Gravel Race. And that was probably one of the most inclusive communities I've ever been part of, even though there's no way I met everybody. There was 3,000 of us there, but it felt like a community because anytime there was anybody stopped on the side of the road, we were asking each other, hey, are you okay? Do you need any help? Hey, how are you doing today? And, our shared goal and our shared value on that was to all have an experience at Mid-South, whether we're doing the 100-mile or the 50-mile or the 12-mile, to experience that together joyfully and to celebrate that. So we came together in community for that weekend. So I'd encourage you to keep that in mind as we go through the rest of these slides about, are you building a group, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with a group, but can you take that group and turn it into a community where you truly care about the well-being for each other or of each other? Okay, so now getting into some of the meatier topics, probably why you're here, is to talk about some of the barriers to inclusion, specifically in the cycling world. This photo is from the first time we ever gave this workshop. This was pre-COVID, probably 3 or 4 years ago now. And we were brainstorming as a group about some of the barriers. And unfortunately, 4 years later, it's still the same. Equipment and clothing with weight limits and some of the technicalities, and we'll get there. Talking about community, am I actually welcome to join this? And then, unfortunately, in the cycling world, some of the rides and races that create pretty big barriers to feeling included, not just for people in larger bodies. They might include people who can't afford them, who don't ride fast enough, who maybe don't feel like they know enough about cycling, but we're going to get into each of these. Okay, so when we are building a community, some things to consider. And actually, this slide should have gone before the barriers. I apologize, but that's okay. We're going to talk about this now. So some things to consider. So when you're thinking about leading a ride, I don't know how many of you are, I hesitate to use this word, but avid cyclists or folks who might be leading a ride. But distance can be a huge thing. If you've been riding a bike for a long time, 10 miles might not seem like a big deal at all. I often have to give myself a reality check when I'm planning out a group ride of, that's a 25-mile route. It's fairly easy. It sounds good. But then I take a step back and say, if I was just starting out or unsure of my abilities, would I even sign up for something that was 25 miles? So really encourage you to keep your distance, at 10 miles or less, especially for some of those introductory or open to everyone rides. Because people can always ride more on their own, or if they're looking for more of a challenge, they can ride to the event, but keeping your actual ride distance at like less than 10 miles, I think is a best practice there. Keep in mind the time of day. If you're planning events during the daytime, who does that exclude? Who does that include? And are you seeking out a certain demographic that maybe isn't attending? If you're planning it on Saturday at noon, maybe are there soccer games that parents couldn't come to or couldn't go to the ride because their kids are at a soccer game. There is no magic answer here. Whenever you plan an event, somebody is going to not be able to attend, but it can definitely be something to keep in mind depending on who you're looking to attract. The pace, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but whatever pace you advertise for the ride, highly encourage sticking to that. Even if you get there and it seems like everybody is in shape and can go faster, you never know if somebody is returning from an injury or, maybe that's just the most comfortable pace for them, but they came to your ride for a reason, and it could be because of the pace that you have advertised. And I'm guilty of that myself, of going faster than I said I was going to. Leaders and sweepers, we will talk about this again in a minute. I've got like 5 best practices that I'd love for you all to take a screenshot of, but making sure that you have identified who's leading the ride, and then who's leading the ride from behind. And what I mean by that is like, who is sweeping? So it's a designated person that stays in the very back of the group and make sure that the whole group gets to where they're going. And they are a critical part of making a ride inclusive. I always like to introduce them at the beginning of a ride, so that way everybody knows, okay, Marley is going to be at the very back. If you have any mechanical troubles or feel like you can't keep up, just stick with Marley and she'll make sure that you make it to the end, or whoever that designated person is. And then a really big one that I think that we don't talk about very often, and we'll talk about a little bit more when we talk about equipment specifics, is there loaner equipment available? There are 1.5 million grants from the bike industry because so many bike companies are trying to do the right thing to get bike equipment available, but making sure that that equipment is actually usable for the folks you're inviting on the ride. And so we'll touch on weight limits here in a couple slides. But, if you are getting bicycles, can you get one that fits the most people height wise? Can you get a step through frame so it fits both short people and tall people? Things like that, helmets. There's all sorts of complicating factors, but it definitely something good to keep in mind. And also a really good reason to have co-organizers so you don't have to do everything on yourself. Another really, really important thing when you are looking towards building an inclusive community is to look at your marketing. Who is in your photos? There's a lot of companies out there who we could use as case studies. If you're familiar with Athleta or Lululemon, they have done a really big push recently to go into extended sizes. And if you go on their website, that reflects it. You see people of all sizes, all shapes, all genders, which makes you feel included. But if you think about, there's some events where the pictures that they have on there are classically pretty people or people of a certain body type. And if you don't see yourself represented in that, more than likely you're not going to go to it. I personally am working with Pearl Izumi. They're one of my employers, I guess. But right now, if you go to their website, you would have absolutely no idea that they make plus size bicycling clothing because none of their models or none of their pictures are people in larger bodies. So trying to get companies and groups to understand that you've got to mirror what you want people to, or who you want to be buying and attending your event. Language is another really big one. Are you using jargon in your advertising materials? Or if you've got a Facebook event, and are you using overly technical language that might turn off people who are unfamiliar with your group or your activity, even though it's supposed to be beginner friendly? So think about this when you are telling people, what equipment they need to bring. Can you make it explicit of you need to bring a helmet, a lock, a water bottle, lights, instead of just saying, come prepared for a night ride, be very explicit in what that actually means. So that way it's obvious to anybody. Also encourage you to think about the communities where you live and maybe do they speak another language? And can you include marketing materials in those languages? I think bicycling culture in the US tends to be very white dominated, even though there are a lot of people of color who ride bicycles, but maybe just haven't been invited to the table, or don't even know what's, and granted, I'm speaking for Seattle specifically. I spent a little bit of time elsewhere, but I've seen the same thing. So I think whatever you can do to be as broad as possible in your marketing efforts. And then finally, location. Where are you advertising? If you're only advertising online, and when I say advertising, I don't necessarily mean just for companies, but if you're putting on a community bike event or a fix a flat repair clinic, where are you putting flyers up? Are you only advertising online? And does that not reach maybe the invisible cyclists who use their bike for transport and aren't using the internet? But, could you put flyers up at the library or at the grocery store, things like that. So that is marketing. And then finally, representation at the rides. So, looking around to see who is showing up to your ride, who's leading the rides. Do the leaders look like the community that they're leading? And if not, are there folks within the community who you could ask to help you lead, with whatever compensation or recognition is appropriate to you? And then finally, where are you riding and does it feel safe? Again, a very, very subjective question. And like me as a white person might have a very different answer to a Black woman in Seattle, where I might choose to lead a ride through one neighborhood that she might say, I would never enter that neighborhood, because of XYZ reasons. So it's really important that you talk to your community, figure out what their needs are, and then work from there. There is no one size fits all answer to any of this. Yeah, James has a great point. And thank you for kind of detailing out what I was trying to say about having a sweeper. And we'll get more into that in a minute. But if you all can take a look in the chat at his comment, he's got some really helpful insight back there or in there. Okay, so kind of going back, sorry, I'm going to go back 2 slides to barriers. So we're going to revisit this topic. So we're going to talk about equipment and clothing and get into some specifics. Talk about a little bit more about community and am I actually welcome, and then events, rides, and races. Okay, so equipment. There's 3 things that I primarily focus on with this, and I've lumped clothing into this, but weight limits on bicycles are a huge thing that a lot of folks don't even know are an issue. I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide and we'll come back to this one. So the weight limits are often hidden in the owner's manual, which can be a little bit awkward if you're going to buy a bicycle because the owner's manual isn't typically attached to the bike. So that's part of the work we're doing with All Bodies on Bikes, is to work with the bike brands to surface this information, make it more readily available. Because right now you either have to like dig around online or dig around in the owner's manual for this information. I pulled up a couple of examples here just to show you how variable it can be. This is from Cervelo, which if you're familiar with Cervelo, they are a pretty fancy brand of high-end, I'd say performance-oriented bicycles. So people looking to go long distances, go fast road riding, and their weight limit reflects that. You know, their weight limit is 194 pounds for these models. Again, I just picked a random thing from their user manual. So don't take this as the word of God as far as Cervelos go. But you can see, you know, the total weight limit for these bikes is only 220 pounds. I would exceed that. And it's a problem because it can be a safety issue. We'll talk about that in just a second. This one over here is from Cannondale. Each bike model has a different weight limit, so depending on the intended use. But you can see this one, you know, the rider, they've allocated for 300 pounds, 30 pounds of luggage, so total 330 pounds. They separate it into touring and trekking, so they give you a little bit more weight if you're bike touring, but just something to keep in mind. And then you get this example with Surly. If any of you are familiar with Surly, they are a Midwest bike company. They make really good bikes and some of my favorite bikes, actually. But they're not quite so prescriptive. You know, they say very generally, we're comfortable with 300-ish pounds. But if you talk to them on the phone, they'll say, we know that our bikes can fit more than that. But in engineering tests, this is what we've tested them to. So you might be saying, well, crap, I work in a bike shop and I know we get people that are bigger than that all the time. How do we get them onto bikes? Or if I'm thinking of creating a bicycle loaner program, how do I make sure that my bikes are safe for people to ride? And that's where components come in. So typically the frame is going to be, how do I want to phrase this? I'm not an engineer. The frame can be the weak point or it can be the strong point. So depending on what the frame material is made out of, and without getting into way too many technical details, basically everything on a bicycle except for a frame can be changed. For larger people, wheels are a really, really good place to start. So often the stock wheels that come on a bike are fairly weak. These lines here are what are called the spokes. And if you've ever seen a bicycle wheel, the more spokes that you have, the stronger the bicycle is going to be. So one really good option for larger folks is to have custom wheels made. It sounds intimidating and expensive, and it can be, but it doesn't have to be. So if anybody is aware of a custom wheel builder in your town, I would love for you to share that information. I know in Seattle, if you go to almost any bike shop and chat with them, they'll be able to build you up a custom set of wheels for $300 or so, which I know sounds expensive, but all things considered, it's not that bad. Other things that have weight limits are this seat post. So that is this one right here that connects your saddle to the frame. The saddle can have weight limits because it has these rails underneath the cushiony part, but all of those can be replaced with stronger materials. So if you've got your heart set on a specific bicycle, but you know that you outweigh that, there are things that you can do to change it up. The other thing to talk about here is tires. So often people in larger bodies get a lot of flat tires, and it doesn't have to be that way. There is nothing inherently that says because you weigh a lot, you're going to get flat tires. Instead, really encouraging folks to air up their tires properly. So if you look on the side of a tire, it will have a inflation window. It'll say, you know, inflate to 45 to 95 or 105 to 125. And I typically encourage folks in larger bodies to go towards the higher end of that spectrum, because you're less likely to get flat tires and pinch flats and things like that. And that can be a really good tip if you've got friends who are trying to get into biking as well. Encouraging everybody before you go out on a ride to check your tire pressure, and hey, let's all air up our tires together, because that can just solve all sorts of problems. Okay, so talking about clothing, this is probably my least favorite topic because it can feel really personal and feel really frustrating. Most bike brands, at least most that you will find in a bike shop, only go up to a 3X, and 3X is not big enough for most folks. So I'm what's considered a small fat. I wear a size like 18 to 20 in regular clothes. I can generally find clothing at almost any store I go to, unless it's bike clothing. So right now, if I walk into REI, I can find hiking clothes, I can find a snow jacket, I can find all sorts of stuff, but for some reason they don't carry the technical stuff. So they don't carry bicycle clothing. So we've put together this list of companies who do carry extended sizes. Terry goes up to a 3X, Pearl Izumi in some things, working to make it more, Machines for Freedom, She Beast, and there's a couple others that we need to add on here as well, Velocio, and a couple other smaller brands. And then there's a few brands that go up to a 6 or 7XL, which is much more inclusive and honestly where we're trying to get all companies to go, because we know that 3X is not big enough. So Aerotech Designs is one that I hear of a lot from a lot of folks they've had great success with. They make really good, thanks for joining, Vanessa. Sorry, I get distracted. I also have ADHD brain. But Aerotech Designs makes outerwear, which is nice. If you're friends with anybody in a larger body, that is often our biggest complaint is rain jackets or rain pants or winter coats. And Aerotech does a great job with that. And then Fat Lad at the back is a wonderful company out of the UK who makes awesome bike clothes with hilarious designs. So shipping is kind of a pain on that one. But if anybody's aware of other companies that are making extended sizes, please let me know and we will include them on this, because this is one of the most frequent questions. One of the lovely things about biking is you don't necessarily need to wear bike specific clothes, but it definitely helps make things more comfortable, especially as you increase your distance and your time on the bike. Any questions about that? And thank you for putting in those resources about Scott and Head Cycling for the custom wheels. Okay, so moving on a little bit to talk about rides and races. These terms are often used interchangeably in the bicycle world. And I would challenge you that if you are putting on an event, to be really clear about which style of event you're actually holding. There's a lot of folks who are not competitive at all and have zero interest in racing. That is the school that I come from. But a lot of the events I'm doing this year have race in the title because there is a winner at the end of the day. It's usually a pro, and it's like 5% of the field is actually competing. So I would love to challenge the notion that everything has to be a race with a prize. You know, most of us are just going out there to have an enjoyable day on the bike and to spend time doing an activity we really love. So if you're looking to increase participation or to make your event more inclusive, does it really have to be called a race? And then one thing that I would really encourage you is in your event planning, Swag is oftentimes included, but oftentimes people in larger bodies are totally left out. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to an event and they had both men's and women's shirts, but the women's only went up to an XL. So, I grab a oversized men's cotton t-shirt, but I'll probably never wear it. But there's a million other ways to do swag or giveaways that don't require body size options. And if you've ordered t-shirts, it's not fun to deal with, of like making sure you have the right size distribution. So, water bottles, hats, keychains, journals, there's a million examples. And if you're struggling for ideas, reach out. What did Kathleen said, in real life, I'm a double XL, but a 2XL in sport clothes, and a 2XL you can't get up to your elbow. What's with the discrepancy in this 2XL versus that 2XL? I don't know. You have really gotten at the heart of the issue. And for a lot of folks, actually, I'll tell you a story about my sister. So my sister is 2 years older than me. She wears a size 14, which is smaller than me. And I was given a bike jacket in a 3XL that wouldn't come close to zipping up. It was just way too small. So I said, hey, Mindy, try this on. She also couldn't zip it up. And she was very, very straightforward and said, if I went into a store and was told to buy a 3 or 4XL, she simply wouldn't do it. So I think brands are catching on to this and realizing that folks, as much as the number on your side or on your tag doesn't actually matter, folks don't necessarily want to buy a size that they don't associate within their brain. So Kathleen, I don't have an answer for you, but it's a giant pet peeve of mine. But also know that I think a lot of the bicycle stuff originated in Europe. A lot of the clothing brands did. And so they were going off of like a very specific race cut, slim fit, very small model. And so now they are kind of retooling that to accommodate for who is actually riding bikes, which is awesome, but I think it's going to take some time. So I would just encourage you to have patience with that, but also make your feelings known to the brands. Even if especially if you're a smaller person, making it known how this impacts you. And, I regularly wear a size, whatever, but in yours, I'm a size, whatever, like this incongruency isn't working. I found brands to be incredibly receptive to that type of feedback. Okay. So kind of moving on from clothes, still talking about how to make something inclusive. So if you are able to, I would take a screenshot of this window. So these are my 5 best practices for a truly inclusive group ride. And when I say this, it's not how do I want to phrase this? You're not going to make everybody happy with every single ride. And that's been a hard learning experience for me, because no matter what you do to try and make something as inclusive and welcoming as possible, things happen. But I think going into this with the best of intents, acknowledging your impact, and working with people to make sure each ride after and after is better and better. So here's my 5 best practices that I would encourage you to take on. So the first one is to have a leader and a sweeper. We talked about this a little bit, and James had a really kind of good example of it, to have multiple sweepers or multiple leaders. That way, if your group is large and you need to break up into 2 different pace groups, you can, but really just so nobody gets left behind, because if you've ever been left behind on a hike or a bike ride or anything, it's really quite a defeating feeling. And I hope, nobody has to go through that in an activity that they really enjoy doing. We touched on this briefly, but sticking to your intended pace. So that might mean the leader needs to use a bike computer. So that way, if you say we're going to go 12 to 14 miles an hour, you actually go 12 to 14 miles an hour. This can be a bit challenging, especially in groups with the accordion effect, where, the groups tend to spread out and come back together and spread out. So it's definitely takes some skill on the leader's part, to hold a steady pace and to regroup as necessary, which takes me to number 3 is to regroup at the top of the hills, but actually give the people in the back a chance to rest. There's so many times when, I'm coming up the back of a group and I get to the top of the hill where everybody else is at, and they say, okay, Marley's here, we can go. And it's like, hey, you guys have been standing around for 5 minutes. Can I get a minute or two to breathe, catch my breath, take some water, get a snack, that sort of thing. And as the leader, or even just as somebody else on the ride, you can always speak up and say, hey, can we wait another minute? And you don't have to call anybody out. You don't have to say the back just got here, but you can just say, I'm not quite ready yet. And then that gives other folks a chance to catch their breath and recover, since you've already had a chance, or the front of the pack has already had a chance to do that. I always encourage a safety brief at the beginning of the ride. So, making sure that everyone knows what is expected of your group ride. If you're riding on city streets, are you taking up the whole lane? Are you going through intersections together as a group? How are you communicating as a group? Every group ride has a different style, where some, will point things out, others will call things out. Just making sure that everybody is on the same page at the beginning of the ride. And then that also helps folks who might be new or who have never done a group ride know what to expect and feel like they are going into this as prepared as possible. And then the last step, although there's probably about 20 more of these, but these are what I always try and include, is just to publicize your route beforehand. So I like to use, there's a tool called Ride with GPS, and I can put this into the chat. And I actually, let me confirm this before I say it, but I'll work with Livy, and I think I have a free trial code for everybody for the premium, which is really cool. But it's a mapping software that helps you map out your route, and it tells you the exact elevation. You can pinpoint little stops along the way. So if there's, a gas station that you want to hit to get snacks, or if there's a park you want to see, you can indicate all of those on the map. And then the people on your ride can look at that in advance and either download it to their phone or to their bike computer. And that just really helps get everybody on the same page. And then I know for me, I have really bad anxiety. So knowing what hills I need to climb and can mentally prepare for that. Or if I've got something going on after the ride, I can stash my car and take off in the middle of the ride. Just publicizing your route helps make everybody feel more prepared. And then God forbid something does go wrong, people's loved ones will know where they were at. And I'm going to pause right here and see if anybody has any other best practices that they would like to share or experiences. Feel free to come off of mute if you want to. Give it like 10 more seconds. Like that awkward classroom. And if I knew you, I would call on somebody, but
I've got one. This isn't necessarily bike related, but like when I used to was a summer camp counselor and leading like group hikes and stuff like that, I always tried to bring like a lot of extra food and stuff. Like anything I would bring for myself, I would bring more of it than I think I need to, just in case somebody misjudged or didn't pack like they would have liked to. So you can always like spread it around and share.
That is such a good idea, Henry. I love that. And I can promise you, if you guys are ever on a ride with me or in an event and you need food, just holler at me. I always have extra food, primarily because I'm afraid of myself running out, but it's always nice to be able to offer it to other folks as well. So yeah, look for Henry on your next ride too. Anybody else have anything they want to add?
Well, I was just going to say, a lot of times with new riders, they're not comfortable in a group, or like in a large group or on city streets. And so I think it's just, helpful to kind of like gauge where people are at or kind of have that conversation. And then also as you're like route planning, like trying to be intentional about finding, a fast group might go on a busy street and not have a big deal, right? If you're going 20 miles an hour in a pack, the cars aren't going to bother you, but that's really intimidating for new riders. And so just being intentional about, if people are comfortable on the road and with a group and figuring out how to assess that for sure as well.
Totally. Thank you so much, Chris. I see James has his hand up.
Yeah, this is excellent. I didn't know we were going to be sharing these experiences, but it's useful to sort of reflect on what has worked in leading group rides in the past. One of the things I'd say that I hadn't heard yet is when I'm leading group rides, I am very loud in declaring what it is that the group's going to be doing soon. So stopping and slowing. So you yell those out really loudly. And so people know, and particularly sort of avoiding the accordion effect. So, turning right, turning left, stopping, slowing, and that would be part of safety briefing, is telling people to listen, and I'll be telling you to, single up or that sort of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. Great point. Thanks, James. And often with that, I will ask folks to repeat what they hear in front of them. So if the leader calls out right turn, asking the folks as they hear it to call it out as well, because depending on the size of your group, the back of the group might have no idea that we're turning soon, and that can be a safety concern. So yeah, thank you definitely for calling that out. Anybody else before we move on to allyship? Okay, cool. We are just about done. So allyship, and this is much broader than bicycling. And this also goes to intersectionality. So not just talking about people in larger bodies, but anybody who's part of a marginalized group. I think these can be especially helpful. These are also, from my personal experience. And so your own experience might vary, and we can get into that in just a second too. But I think the biggest one is just communication, asking what your friends need or want. And so taking this specifically into a bicycling context, I love to ride alone. Like if I'm in a group, or if I'm doing a 50-mile gravel ride with my friends, I like to go at my own pace and regroup at the top of hills. My friend Kaylee, my co-founder, really likes to ride alongside other people. So asking your friend who might be of a different pace than you, hey, how do you want to do this today? Are we stopping for each other at turns? Are we riding together the whole time? Just figuring out and asking what they need or want. And that works in all sorts of situations: traveling, hiking, biking, anything. The second one is to take on the emotional asks. So using whatever relative power you have to take on the weight of the ask. And what I mean by that is your fat friend is already thinking about if they can fit in the kayak, or if they are too heavy for the zip line, or whatever activity it might be. So if you, as the smaller friend or the person with more power in the relationship, can call the kayak company and say, hey, do you have a weight limit? What sizes fit into whatever it might be. If you're going to Disneyland, researching if there's any roller coasters that you need to avoid. I can guarantee you your fat friend is already thinking about it and is nervous about it. And so if you're able to take that on and just say, hey, we booked a horseback riding, the weight limit's 350 pounds. Is that going to be an issue? Or whatever it might be. And your friend will more than likely appreciate that. They will probably have already done the research themselves too, but it can be really, really nice to know that your friends are looking out for you in that situation. Number 3 is kind of the same thing, but to use your relative privilege in the space. So like we were talking about regrouping at the top of hills, if you're one of the first people up the hill, using that to say, okay, hey, let's make sure we wait for everybody else. Or this might sound really silly, but sometimes as a larger person, we're intimidated to eat in front of people, or to express that we're struggling, or, breathing hard. So if you in a smaller body can say, hey, I'm going to grab a snack, or can we stop for a snack? Or, hey, that was a really hard hill. It kind of levels the playing field and normalizes those things that are totally normal. Every human needs to eat, but sometimes as the fat person, I'm afraid that people are looking at me and like, oh, of course she's eating, so using whatever power you have to normalize everyday activities. And I know it sounds silly, but trust me that it is a thing that we think about. This is probably the biggest one that anybody can do, is to use your money to support inclusive brands. So the way I like to think about this is, if you wore a size or two bigger than you wear now, could you still shop at the same brands and stores? If not, maybe it's time to, shop with a different brand and let that other brand know why you're not shopping with them. When we're having these conversations with companies, we often hear, well, there's just no market demand. And sometimes I want to slap them and say, no, there is a market demand. We just know that there's nothing for us at your store, so we don't even try. But when people in smaller bodies can reiterate that, it makes it so much easier. So I think about Patagonia, for example. Everybody loves Patagonia because they're great on the environment, on their political stances, all sorts of things. Their sizing is awful. I can't wear almost anything in there unless I go to the men's sizes, which will be too big and like just ill-fitting. So just encourage you, when you're in there, even if you wear a size medium, look and see, is there a double XL? Do they make bigger sizes? And if not, can you share that feedback with them and say, I would really love it if you made XYZ in bigger sizes. And then finally, learn and lead. So you're all showing that you're curious about this and interested by attending this. I really appreciate you for that. But how can you continue to pass on the knowledge? So, folks, when they go to your bike ride or they go to your hike or whatever, might not know that you're doing this all intentionally, but they will feel it. They'll remember how they felt, either included or not included, and then continue to spread that on. I will pause there and see if anybody else has suggestions or things that have been helpful for you in being an ally or having allyship demonstrated. And again, it's okay if not. I realize that we don't have these conversations often about body size. It's often a taboo topic, which is why we're having this conversation, because so many of us live in larger bodies or bodies with disabilities. And just normalizing the conversation can go so much farther. Thank you, Bethany. Yeah, and again, everybody's different. So, your friend might not appreciate you taking on that ask, but I can be pretty certain that we've thought about it, thinking about when you go to a restaurant, if there's the option to sit at tables instead of a booth, because oftentimes we don't fit into booths comfortably. If you're somewhere and the chairs are really narrow with arms, asking, hey, do you have any chairs that are larger or stronger? If you're putting on an event, think about the chairs that you have in the space and who is capable of actually sitting in them comfortably. I have only broken one chair in my life. And I think that chair, I think anybody would have broken it, but it is not a good feeling to be sitting on something and not sure if it's going to support your weight. So again, that's using your relative privilege and power. So if you're setting up a retail display booth, is there space to move through, either for larger bodies, parents with strollers, people using a wheelchair? There's so many ways that we can make our whole world more inclusive without diminishing anybody's individual experience. Okay, so kind of finishing up, and we'll leave about 5 minutes for questions. Would love for folks to get involved in this community. So All Bodies on Bikes is all about size inclusion, but that means everybody, regardless of your size. And so right now we are recruiting chapter leaders. So I mentioned earlier that whenever we travel somewhere, we try and host a group ride. I travel a lot, but still not as much as people would like us to. So if you're interested in being a chapter leader and hosting local rides in your community, I'll make sure that, can we send out an email to everyone with some links after this call? Perfect.
For sure,
I'll make sure that gets included in there. And then if you're going to be at any, big events this summer, whether that's Steamboat Gravel or Unbound or Gravel Worlds, I don't know of any events happening in Wisconsin, but let me know if there are any and I'll try and make it. We always try and do a group ride there that's open to everyone, regardless if you're doing the event or not. So that is what I have. I put Kaylee's contact on here as well. She is another phenomenal resource. So if you have other questions, here's either Marley at All Bodies on Bikes or Marley Blonsky. But I'll go ahead and open up the floor to any questions or comments. And I really appreciate you all attending.
I have a question kind of off of Chris's point that he mentioned about the roads issue with, newer bikers. What have been like when you're leading group rides, how do you kind of help people if you have to ride on roads, especially like public roads? Like what has been the strategy to help people feel more comfortable with that outside of just like, experience?
Yeah. So I encourage people to be as predictable as possible. If we're going to ride in a group, I say, no more than 2 abroad. We are, depending on the road, take the lane. If it's like a 2-lane highway, I'm not going to say take the lane. I'm going to say single file. So it kind of depends on the road situation, but I tell people to, be predictable, use your hand signals, don't veer in and out of traffic. Basically think about it, if you were a motorist, how you would engage with that cyclist, how you would want to engage. And so just to be that person, riding in a straight line, making your intentions clear. I think that's the best thing. And then I always warn people at the beginning of a ride, like, hey, we're going to be, spending a mile or 2 on this busy road. We'll regroup as necessary, but just remembering that like you have the full legal right to take up space, but to not be a jerk about it. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. It can always be challenging, especially for newer cyclists. We're like, I'm not riding on that road. And you're like, well, it's our only choice. Yeah, Bethany, I'll do my best to address that. So the transition from childhood, riding bikes is fun, to growing up and being a bike rider. What do I want to say about this? So yeah, I try and bring joy into my rides, but and I have no idea what the traffic situation is like for you all. But I try and use my bike as a tool. So whether that's going to the grocery store and getting groceries or going to the library on my bike, trying to incorporate it into my daily routine, but making it fun. So, stopping for ice cream or stopping at a park that's really enjoyable. Some of those things that is a little bit harder to do in a car because you would need to find parking and you would need to navigate all those things. Yeah, I don't know. I think for me when I was a kid, a bike was a toy. And now that I'm an adult, it still is a toy sometimes, but more often it's a transportation tool. I'm not sure if that answered your question or not, but I hope it did. We've got about 1 more minute if anybody has any other questions. And I can stick around for a couple minutes if that's okay. Yeah, so Rebecca, I do recommend, depending on your budget, so bikes can be prohibitively expensive, which is unfortunate. So if you are on a budget looking at like a used 90s mountain bike, if you can get your hands on like a Specialized rock hopper or a stump jumper, or just some of those older steel mountain bikes, those are excellent bikes for bigger people. They often have 26-inch wheels, so you can get a little bit of a thicker tire, you can get strong wheels, strong brakes. If your budget allows for it, looking at some of the more modern steel bikes, so Surly or All City, I think steel is really your best friend if you're a heavier rider, unless money is truly no object, and then you can look at like titanium and some carbon, but carbon definitely can be a fraught issue for people in larger bodies. And I can send that into the email as well. Yeah, definitely. Bikes can definitely change lives. They've changed my life in many ways. So really appreciate you all joining. I think that's all I have.
Well, I just wanted to give a big thank you one more time because this was really great. And I know I learned a whole lot. So we really appreciate you coming.
Thank you. And honestly, feel free to reach out with questions. This is my full-time job now, thankfully. So I have time to answer emails and, get on other calls or troubleshoot things with you. If you want personalized bike recommendations, reach out. All right.
Alrighty, well, we'll get that information out to you when we can. But thanks everybody for coming. This will be recorded, so if you want to share it out with anybody that you think would like it, it'll be up on our YouTube, and I'll be sure to put that in an email as well when we get that up. So yeah.
And I will send you an email, Livy, with all of those things that we talked about.
Perfect. Sounds great.
Cool. Thank you all for
everybody.
actively participating.
Have a good night, everybody.
Bye.